China just deployed millions of rabbits into one of the world's harshest deserts. And what scientists discovered 5 years later has environmental experts worldwide completely rethinking how we fight desertification. When the project was first announced, critics called it insane. Releasing massive rabbit populations into fragile desert ecosystems had previously caused ecological disasters in other countries. Australia's rabbit plague turned productive grasslands into wastelands. Europe's uncontrolled rabbit populations devastated agricultural regions. The idea seemed destined for catastrophe. But China wasn't releasing random rabbits into random desert. They engineered an entire ecosystem from scratch, combining specific rabbit breeds with carefully selected plant species, renewable energy infrastructure, and precision management techniques. The result? A transformation so dramatic that satellite imagery shows desert literally turning green in real time. Before we reveal how fluffy animals and strategic planning turned wasteland into profitable farmland, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because this story proves that solutions to climate change might come from the most unexpected places. What happened in China's deserts isn't just about rabbits. It's about reimagining our relationship with degraded landscapes and proving that ecological restoration can be both environmentally beneficial and economically profitable. Let's see how they did it. To understand the miracle, we first need to understand the disaster. Northern China contains some of the planet's most aggressive desert systems, vast sandy wastelands that advance relentlessly toward populated regions, swallowing everything in their path. These aren't ancient, unchanging deserts. They're expanding disaster zones, growing by thousands of acres annually as a result of climate change, overgrazing, deforestation, and unsustainable agricultural practices. Villages that existed for centuries found themselves buried under advancing sand dunes. Farmland that fed communities for generations transformed into sterile wastelands within a single lifetime. The human toll was staggering. Millions of people abandoned their ancestral homes as water sources dried up and crops failed repeatedly. Entire towns became ghost settlements, their buildings half buried in sand, streets transformed into dunes, wells turned to dust. The desert wasn't just advancing, it was erasing human presence from the landscape. But the environmental destruction extended far beyond the immediate desert zones. Massive sandstorms originating from these expanding deserts traveled thousands of miles, blanketing cities in choking dust, disrupting transportation, causing respiratory illnesses, and depositing millions of tons of sand on productive farmland. Beijing, located hundreds of miles from the nearest major desert, regularly experienced sandstorms so severe that visibility dropped to near zero and the air became hazardous to breathe. The economic cost of these storms, crop damage, health impacts, infrastructure wear, lost productivity, reached billions of dollars annually. The Chinese government recognized that desert expansion represented an existential threat to the nation's food security, public health, and economic development. Traditional approaches to desertification had achieved limited success. Planting trees helped in some areas, but most species couldn't survive the extreme conditions. Building barriers slowed sand movement temporarily, but didn't address the fundamental problem of soil degradation. What they needed was a completely new approach, one that didn't just fight the desert, but actually transformed it into productive land. And that's where the rabbits entered the story. The specific desert chosen for the experimental project stretched across thousands of square miles of what seemed like lifeless terrain. Summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter cold plunged below zero. Rainfall averaged less than 4 inches annually. Wind speeds regularly topped 50 miles per hour, creating sandstorms that could strip paint from vehicles and scour skin from exposed flesh. No crops grew there. No animals lived there permanently. The few hardy desert plants that survived produced minimal biomass and did nothing to stabilize the mobile sand dunes that shifted and reformed with every storm. By every conventional measure, this land was beyond saving. But conventional measures were about to be challenged in the most unexpected way. The choice of rabbits wasn't random or impulsive. It resulted from years of research into which animals could survive in extreme desert conditions while providing maximum ecological benefit. And rabbits, specifically certain breeds engineered for harsh environments, checked every box. The selected breed possessed remarkable adaptations. They required minimal water, obtaining most moisture from the plants they consumed. They tolerated temperature extremes that would kill most livestock. They reproduced rapidly, reaching breeding maturity in months rather than years. And crucially, they produced something the desert desperately needed: manure. But before releasing a single rabbit, the project team had to prepare the environment. You can't just dump animals into bare sand and expect results. The desert needed infrastructure, the beginnings of an ecosystem that rabbits could then expand and enhance. The preparation phase involved engineering on a massive scale. Workers installed thousands of miles of irrigation systems using underground pipes to minimize evaporation. They constructed windbreak fences to reduce the sandstorms that could bury young plants overnight. They trucked in hundreds of thousands of tons of organic material to provide initial nutrients for vegetation. Then came the plants. But not just any plants, specifically selected species known to thrive in arid conditions. Deep-rooted varieties that could tap underground water sources. Nitrogen-fixing species that could enrich the nutrient-poor sand. Fast-growing pioneers that could provide quick ground cover to stabilize the shifting dunes. One plant, in particular, became the cornerstone of the entire project. A specially bred variety of desert shrub with roots that extended over 30 feet underground, far deeper than typical desert vegetation. These roots didn't just find water. They created channels through compacted sand, improving drainage and allowing other plants to establish. The shrub also produced abundant foliage that could feed rabbits while withstanding repeated grazing without dying. Once enough of these foundation plants had established, a process taking several years, the rabbit introduction could begin. But even this happened gradually, not as a massive release, but as a carefully controlled population build-up, starting in enclosed sections before expanding across larger areas. The first rabbits were released into fenced demonstration zones where every aspect of their impact could be monitored. Researchers tracked vegetation changes, soil composition shifts, water table fluctuations, and wildlife responses. The data would determine whether to expand the project or abandon it as a failed experiment. Initial results exceeded expectations. The rabbits didn't just survive, they thrived. Within months, population counts showed successful breeding. More importantly, their impact on the environment was exactly what researchers had hoped for. What rabbits do to an ecosystem sounds simple, but has profound implications. They eat plants, they produce waste, they dig burrows. Each of these activities transforms desert in ways that create cascading positive effects. Let's start with the eating. Rabbits consumed the desert shrubs that had been planted specifically for them. But unlike other grazers that can strip vegetation down to bare ground and kill plants, rabbits engaged in what ecologists call beneficial grazing pressure. They trimmed plants without destroying them, actually stimulating new growth through a process similar to pruning. The plants responded to this grazing by producing more shoots, more leaves, more biomass. The rabbits had created a feedback loop where their consumption encouraged the very food source they depended on to grow more vigorously. It's counterintuitive. Eating plants helps them grow, but it's well documented in ecological systems where grazers and plants evolve together. Then there's the manure. This might seem mundane, but in desert ecology, it's transformative. The sand that dominates deserts contains virtually no organic matter, no nitrogen, no phosphorus, none of the nutrients plants need to grow. It's essentially sterile mineral particles that won't support life without amendment. Rabbit manure changed that equation. Each rabbit produced substantial daily quantities of nutrient-rich waste, multiplied across millions of rabbits that represented thousands of tons of organic fertilizer being deposited across the desert daily. This fertilizer didn't need to be transported, processed, or applied. The rabbits distributed it naturally as they moved through the environment. But the transformation wasn't just chemical, it was physical. Organic matter in the form of manure improved soil structure, increasing water retention and reducing erosion. Sand that had been blown around by every breeze became slightly sticky, slightly cohesive, beginning the transition from sterile sand to actual soil capable of supporting diverse plant life. The burrowing behavior added another dimension to the ecological transformation. Rabbits dug extensive tunnel networks, some extending several feet underground. These burrows weren't just homes. They were infrastructure that benefited the entire ecosystem. The tunnels captured rainwater that would otherwise run off the surface or evaporate, directing it deep into the soil where plant roots could access it. They created microhabitats with different temperature and humidity conditions than the surface, allowing different plant species to establish in and around the burrow entrances. They mixed deep and surface soil layers, distributing nutrients and breaking up compacted sand. Perhaps most importantly, the burrows became homes for other desert species. Insects colonized the tunnels, creating food sources for birds and lizards. Small rodents found shelter in abandoned rabbit burrows. Even some plant seeds, dropped into tunnel entrances by birds or wind, found ideal germination conditions in the protected, slightly moist environment. Within just a few years, areas with established rabbit populations showed vegetation density increases of 300% or more. Plants grew taller, produced more seeds, and included a greater variety of species. What had been uniform sand dunes began differentiating into varied terrain, patches of dense vegetation, open sandy areas, and everything in between. The biodiversity explosion was unexpected in its speed. Birds returned to areas that hadn't seen them in decades. Insects diversified. Native plant species that had vanished from the region reappeared, either from seeds that had lain dormant, waiting for conditions to improve, or from windborne seeds that could now find suitable habitat. Ecological restoration is admirable, but in the real world, projects need funding, and funding requires economic justification. The Rabbit Desert Project wasn't just about environmental recovery, it became a profitable enterprise that paid for its own expansion while providing livelihoods for thousands of people. The economics started with rabbit products. These weren't wild rabbits left to their own devices. They were managed livestock that happened to live in semi-natural desert conditions. That management included selective breeding programs that enhanced desirable traits, health monitoring to prevent disease outbreaks, and periodic harvesting to prevent overpopulation. Rabbit meat became the first product stream. Lean, mild-flavored, and produced without the environmental costs of traditional livestock farming, it found ready markets domestically and internationally. The desert-raised rabbits were marketed as sustainably produced, with meat from animals that had actually helped restore degraded land, rather than contributing to environmental damage. Then came the fur. Certain rabbit breeds produce exceptionally high-quality pelts that command premium prices in global markets. The Desert Project incorporated these breeds, creating a fur industry that generated substantial revenue while maintaining the ecological benefits. The rabbits still grazed, still produced fertilizer, still dug burrows. They just also provided valuable pelts after harvest. But the breakthrough economic innovation came from integrating the rabbit ecosystem with renewable energy. Project planners realized the desert offered another resource beyond rabbits: endless sunshine perfect for solar energy generation. Solar panel arrays were installed across vast stretches of the restored desert. But instead of clearing vegetation to install panels, designers elevated the arrays on structures that allowed plants to continue growing underneath. The panels provided shade that actually benefited vegetation by reducing evaporation and protecting plants from the most intense midday sun. The rabbits, remarkably, integrated perfectly into this solar infrastructure. They grazed the vegetation, growing beneath panels, preventing overgrowth that could shade the solar cells or create fire hazards. Their manure continued fertilizing the soil. Their burrowing didn't damage panel foundations because the structures were designed with wildlife in mind. This created a triple revenue stream: renewable electricity sold to the grid, rabbit products sold to markets, and carbon credits sold to companies offsetting their emissions. The same land produced food, energy, and environmental benefits simultaneously, a dramatic improvement over traditional desert, which produced nothing at all. Local communities benefited directly. Thousands of jobs were created in rabbit management, solar panel maintenance, processing facilities, and supporting industries. People who had abandoned the region due to desertification could return, not just to survive, but to thrive in a newly created green economy. The economic success ensured project sustainability. Rather than depending on government subsidies that might disappear with changing priorities, the rabbit desert restoration paid for itself and generated profits that funded expansion into additional degraded areas. No large-scale ecological project unfolds without challenges, and the rabbit desert transformation faced serious obstacles that threatened its success. Understanding these difficulties is crucial for anyone hoping to replicate the model elsewhere. Disease management emerged as an early crisis. When you concentrate millions of rabbits in relatively confined areas, infectious diseases can spread rapidly. Several outbreaks of rabbit-specific illnesses threatened to wipe out entire populations before veterinary protocols could contain them. The solution involved establishing quarantine zones, implementing vaccination programs, and maintaining genetic diversity to prevent disease susceptibility. It required constant vigilance and significant investment in animal health infrastructure. Some critics argue these costs undermine claims of economic viability, though project managers counter that established disease prevention protocols are now relatively inexpensive to maintain. Predator management presented another challenge. As rabbit populations exploded, they attracted natural predators: foxes, eagles, feral dogs. While predation is a natural part of ecosystems, too many predators could destabilize carefully managed rabbit numbers and threaten the economic viability of harvesting programs. The project adopted a middle path, allowing some natural predation to maintain ecosystem balance while controlling predator populations enough to protect rabbit numbers. This required ongoing monitoring and occasional intervention, adding complexity and cost to management. Water availability became unexpectedly problematic. Although the desert shrubs and rabbits were selected for drought tolerance, complete absence of water makes life impossible. The project initially relied on underground wells, but drawdown rates raised concerns about long-term groundwater sustainability. Researchers address this by implementing sophisticated water recycling systems, capturing and treating all wastewater from rabbit facilities for irrigation use. They also experimented with atmospheric water harvesting technologies that pull moisture from air, though these remain expensive and experimental. Some environmental groups questioned whether introducing millions of non-native rabbits to desert ecosystems constituted ecological colonization that could harm native species. These critics pointed to Australia's devastating experience with European rabbits as a cautionary tale. Project defenders responded that Chinese deserts had been so degraded they barely qualified as ecosystems anymore. They were essentially biological deserts with minimal native species remaining. The Rabbit Project, they argued, was creating new habitat that native species could eventually recolonize, not destroying existing natural systems. The debate continued, with some environmentalists remaining skeptical despite evidence of biodiversity increases in project areas. This tension highlights broader questions about ecological restoration. Should we try to restore degraded land to some previous natural state? Or is creating entirely new stable ecosystems an acceptable alternative? The success of China's Rabbit Desert Project attracted international attention from countries facing their own desertification crises, and several have begun adapting the model to their specific conditions with varying results. Middle Eastern nations, possessing vast deserts and abundant solar potential, saw immediate applications. Several Gulf states initiated pilot programs combining rabbit grazing with solar energy production. The adaptations included different plant species suited to more extreme heat and rabbit breeds with even greater heat tolerance. Initial results have been promising, though the projects remain smaller scale than China's implementation. Cultural factors play a role. Rabbit meat isn't universally accepted in Middle Eastern cuisines, requiring different economic models, focused more heavily on energy production and carbon credits than livestock products. African countries struggling with expanding deserts have expressed strong interest but face funding challenges. The upfront investment required for infrastructure, fencing, irrigation systems, and rabbit stock exceeds what many nations can afford without international assistance. Some partnerships are forming between Chinese companies with rabbit desert expertise and African governments providing land and regulatory support. Australia approached the concept with extreme caution given their historical rabbit disaster. But pilot projects in carefully controlled areas are testing whether intensive management and specific rabbit breeds could avoid the ecological catastrophe of past uncontrolled populations. Early data suggests that with proper protocols, rabbits can be managed sustainably even in Australia's sensitive ecosystems. The European Union has funded research into applying similar principles to degraded agricultural land in southern Europe, where climate change is expanding arid zones. Spain and Greece are running experimental programs, though these focus more on soil restoration than desert transformation since the starting conditions are less severe than in China. Perhaps most significantly, the Rabbit Desert Project has influenced thinking about ecological restoration globally. It demonstrated that restoration doesn't require returning land to some imagined pristine natural state. Instead, creating stable, productive, biodiverse ecosystems adapted to current conditions can be equally valuable, perhaps more so in a rapidly changing climate. The project also proved that ecological restoration can be economically profitable rather than a perpetual cost. This realization is prompting governments and private investors to reconsider degraded lands not as worthless wastelands, but as potential assets waiting to be activated through strategic intervention. Understanding why the Rabbit Desert project succeeded requires diving into the ecological principles that make it work. And those principles offer insights applicable far beyond desert restoration. The foundation is the concept of ecological facilitation, where one species creates conditions that allow other species to thrive. Rabbits facilitated plant growth through manure deposition and grazing pressure that stimulated vegetation. Plants facilitated rabbit survival by providing food and burrow stability. Both facilitated soil formation, which facilitated microbial communities, which further facilitated plant growth. This positive feedback loop is the opposite of the negative feedback loops that created the desert in the first place. Overgrazing removed vegetation, which allowed wind erosion, which removed remaining soil, which prevented vegetation recovery, a downward spiral into barrenness. The Rabbit Project reversed that spiral by introducing strong positive feedbacks. Each improvement enabled additional improvements, creating an upward spiral toward ecosystem recovery. The trick was providing enough initial input, infrastructure, water, first-generation plants, to jumpstart the positive feedbacks. Another key principle is functional diversity. The project didn't rely on a single species or approach. It combined rabbits, multiple plant species, renewable energy, and human management into an integrated system where failure of any one component wouldn't collapse the whole. This redundancy and diversity make the system resilient to shocks. Drought might reduce rabbit populations, but surviving plants hold soil and provide recovery base. Disease might affect rabbits, but established vegetation continues stabilizing land. Equipment failures might reduce solar output, but the ecological restoration continues independently. The scale of intervention matters too. Small pilot projects often fail because they're too limited to create self-sustaining dynamics. The Rabbit Project succeeded partly because it operated at landscape scale, thousands of square miles rather than a few hundred acres. At that scale, the created ecosystem could support complete ecological processes, including predator-prey relationships, plant reproduction cycles, and nutrient cycling. Adaptive management proved crucial. The project didn't follow a rigid blueprint. Instead, managers continuously monitored results and adjusted approaches based on what worked. When certain plant species failed to thrive, different ones were substituted. When rabbit diseases emerged, vaccination protocols were developed. This flexibility allowed the project to evolve and improve over time, rather than failing when initial assumptions proved incorrect. Finally, the integration of economic and ecological goals created stakeholder alignment. If the project had been purely environmental, it might have lost political support during economic downturns. If it had been purely commercial, ecological corners might have been cut. Combining both goals ensured that success required delivering on both dimensions, creating accountability and long-term commitment. The Rabbit Desert transformation represents more than just one successful environmental project. It's a proof of concept for how humanity might address climate change, desertification, and ecological degradation globally. For decades, environmental restoration was seen as expensive, slow, and requiring perpetual subsidies. The Rabbit Project proves that restoration can be fast, profitable, and self-sustaining when designed correctly. This shifts the entire economic calculation around environmental action. Degraded land worldwide, estimated at billions of acres, could potentially be transformed using similar principles adapted to local conditions. The challenge isn't technological or ecological. It's organizational and financial, requiring upfront investment and patient capital willing to wait several years for returns. But the returns, when they come, can be substantial. Land that produces nothing becomes land generating multiple revenue streams. Populations displaced by environmental degradation can return. Carbon gets sequestered from the atmosphere. Biodiversity recovers. Regional climates stabilize as vegetation influences local rainfall patterns and temperatures. China released millions of rabbits into the desert. What happened next shocked the world. The desert turned green, communities returned, and profitable ecosystems emerged from barren sand. This isn't just about rabbits or China. It's about reimagining our relationship with damaged land and recognizing that ecological restoration might be one of the 21st century's greatest economic opportunities. What do you think? Could rabbit-based restoration work in other deserts globally? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe because we're covering more revolutionary solutions to climate change that you won't believe are real.